Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start my presentation, if there are any EMIs or crime scene investigators, PROA, in conjunction with RAGE, produced a number of booklets, and I have two in my hand as an example. There are a remaining few on the table we have distributed. Some of you may have already, but if you haven't and would like samples, but please, this is specific for the investigators. This is not for the individuals on the academic side. Right, Rhino in crisis and the road to CITES. Those of you who do not know, PROA is the Private Rhino Owners Association, born of need, born in 2008, 2009 as a direct result of the beginning of the poaching crisis. I want to cover four areas in my presentation. I want to do a quick run through of the situation analysis, a bit of history. I want to discuss conservation polarization, which is a very, very alarming trend that we're all exposed to. And then finally, so what's the future? A little bit of background. Most of you obviously know this, but just to set the scene, that we know the scientific order of rhino: odd-toed ungulate, shed, zebra, your equine, then breaking it down into your species, subspecies. What is of relevance here is if one looks on the far left of the screen, you see the skull and crossbone of your northern white and your northwestern black, either extinct or considered extinct. And when one looks at some of the declining figures, obviously this is a trend that we cannot allow to continue. A lot of people don't realize that, in fact, they talk about a black rhino and a white rhino and think, well, that's it. They don't realize the various subspecies, so this is purely just a little bit of educational for those who may not know of the split between the subspecies found in Namibia, KZN, going up into Tanzania. And there also Richard reflected on some of these figures, but what's relevant here is that some 40% of black rhino found here in South Africa, 92% of white. When one looks at, so where did the other rhino go? Well, further on in my presentation, you'll see how many of the range states have either lost their entire populations or have marginal populations. A country like Uganda sitting with 13 rhino. This slide you sadly know all too well, and I must also point out to you that the last 2 months of the year normally are a much more aggressive poaching period. So certainly, whilst the official figure is some 969 today or a day or so ago, the figure certainly will go in excess of 1,140. There's a typo there. It's over 3,000 rhino poached in South Africa from the year 2000. That is preceding period. Our losses to date exceed 1 billion rand. The asset value has deteriorated substantially, and I make reference there to the latest figure. So now I'm pulling this back into where are we in terms of the private rhino owners? How do we fit into this rugby match? Well, we own some between 24 and 27%. It depends on which survey figures you look at, but between 4,500 and 5,000 white rhino are held in private custodianship or ownership. And similarly, 450 odd black rhino. We have about 380 reserves. I use the word about because there has been quite a high level of disinvestment, and we will be carrying out a survey early in the new year to determine, but when you have a reserve that historically had both black and white rhino, and despite best practices in terms of security, high-tech security, utilization of Bushman trackers, armed guards, etc., that the owner finally gave up because they simply cannot handle the trauma nor the cost. So from our survey, we picked up, and this was done just before CITES, in other words, in about January of 2013, the survey showed the following: 47% will keep rhino. In other words, those are reserves like Sabi-San, Timbavati, Shamwari, Punda, etc. So those are the real bitter einders. Then the others who are smaller operations, much more influenced by economics, have said collectively 53% will consider or are selling or have sold already. In other words, when we broke that 53% down, 11% reported that they had sold or lost all their rhino already. And thus the figure that you see lower down, an estimated loss of habitat of some 430,000 hectare. And also when one looks a year before, in 2012, we only had some 20% of reserves having experienced some kind of a poaching incident. That has now climbed very, very drastically to 80%. So in other words, the better Kruger becomes in their anti-poaching strategies, we then become the soft target. Windows of opportunity is obviously to poach in Kruger. You have a fair amount of time after the rhino has been poached or to intercept a poacher group. Whilst on your provincial and private reserves, you talk literally minutes, 20 minutes to half an hour before that individual has crossed out of your property and out of your control. Okay, so of the 3,600 odd rhino killed, just under 1,000 on private reserves, representing a financial loss of 325 million rand. Now again, that situation when you drive in Kruger and you see a rhino, it's magnificent to see. But however, when you've actually paid for that rhino, when you've bought it, you've watched them breed up, and you lose an animal, believe me, it's like losing a family member. When one looks at your population analysis, we are already seeing, I'm talking about private reserves now, a decline in population in those key provinces, in Mpumalanga in particular, sitting at some 9.3%. So again, a very alarming trend. So, but, you know, and again, I'm going to go into a bit more detail on this, but just as a footnote there, that if we had the access to sustainable utilization, a huge chunk of that revenue, where 100% has gone to the criminal syndicates and element, could have come back into rhino conservation and protection. Bearing in mind that we do not have the big dollar donors, funders and supporters. The private sector are pretty much paddling this canoe on their own. What is security costing us? Well, we surveyed our members, and this is the kind of information that we got back. There was a 20,000 hectare reserve costing some 4 million rands a year, and so you can see the breakdown. So what we did is we basically asked two questions. A, what is the size of your reserve? And B, what are you spending on rhino security? We're not interested in what you're spending on lodge security. What are you spending on rhino security? We took the two figures, added them up, divided them by the number of hectare, and divided it by, or multiplied it out by the amount of hectarage, which is some 2 million hectare. So now we're sitting with some 272 million rand is what we, the private sector, are spending. That's what we're spending, but we're not getting any kind of income. Now what also has to be borne in mind here is, as Sam made reference to his 2 million hectare, the state of Israel. Well, we, the private sector, are also looking after the state of Israel, but it comprises 380 islands, and we have very little help to look after our beaches. And as I indicate there, with zero assistance in any form of incentive from government other than the normal law enforcement. The interdependency that exists. Now, I jokingly refer to KZN and Ezemvelo, sand parks, etc., as the factories. In other words, in the good times, the factories are at maximum capacity, and they sell off their excess animals off to the private sector. So that is your growth curve A, which is what happens when up until about 2008. Now what we are seeing is, as a result of poaching pressure, the lack of ability to trade, to get meaningful revenue for a high-priced asset, and you're starting to see this kind of decline, as I'm showing there in curve B. So therefore you have a tidal phenomena. The good times, in other words, when the tide came in, we had a tripartite beneficial relationship. Sand parks were able to sell rhino off to the private sector. They benefited from getting a revenue to go back into their own conservation projects, etc. Private owners were happy to buy and expand either existing herds or introduce animals into new habitat, and obviously that's your third corner there where the rhino themselves are in a range expansion scenario as well as introduction of new blood, and so it carries on. Sadly, that tide is now going out, so the arrow is now going the other way, and we are seeing a shrinking range, less distribution of rhino than we had before, and this tendency is starting to become quite alarming for us. So up until now, since the 60s, the private sector have played a key role in terms of stimulating, call it rhino economics. But now you saw very, very well presented in Richard's talk what the real terms are. So in other words, where would the smart money go? Should I invest in rhino, or maybe I should do something like invest in black impala or some strange thing like that. But there's major concern in terms of investor confidence in product rhino. Okay, so I've already touched on this survey that over 3,000 of rhino owners indicated prior to CITES their principal support. 80% supported the principles of legal hunting. They strongly request the lifting of the domestic moratorium. 97% support the notion of legalized trade. 47% will keep their rhino whatever. So what is the value onto a rhino reserve? Well, it has 4 key values, 3 legal and 1 illegal. As already been touched on before, there's a tourism value, there's an existence value, in other words, revenue coming in from the sale of assets, of excess animals, and then trophy hunting. And this is an area where a lot of people don't understand, because they say, how is it possible when you've got a poaching pressure, you can still allow hunting? Well, bearing in mind that in the true sense of the word, a trophy hunter is coming here to hunt an animal of a particular trophy size, and this is typically an animal that is no longer biologically active, and that brings a very substantive quantum of revenue back into the conservation field. And obviously the last one is that of the potential product value of the sale of rhino horn. And this goes back again to aspects such as conservation, range expansion, job creation, economic yield, community benefits, etc., which have been referred to by earlier speakers. So therefore, where are we? The private owners now find themselves sitting on a cliff edge. We've lost assets to the value of some 325 million. Our security costs are costing us some 272 million. If one looks at what we, provincial and national parks, are spending, the figure is sitting at about 1.4 billion rands a year. It is no longer sustainable. We cannot afford this. We need a change in direction. The third bullet point makes reference to the Kenya application before CITES last year, where they were applying for a 0 quota to South Africa. In other words, effectively putting a hold on hunting, legal hunting in South Africa, export of trophies, which would have effectively removed the third of our or one of our 3 economic pillars. So we've already seen now the disinvestment that I referred to. So where are we in terms of strategy? Since 1980 to 83, we've seen 83% of the decline of black rhino populations. We see the number of animals killed over the last 45 years. I made reference to the range states that have either lost their animals or really don't have a viable species, a number of animals rather. So more of the same. The 77 CITES ban is not working. It is not stopping the slaughter of rhino. The criminalized trade is allowing the dollar benefit to go 100% to the criminals, and we need to effect a change of direction. So past to present, the ban came in. In 1992, we already made reference to the fact that the strategy was not effectively saving lives. Poaching comes to South Africa 2008-2010. The security strategy is released and the RIM process begins. The results were that the position, the recommendations of the RIM report are supported by those organizations. Sorry, I'm speeding up a bit. I only have 5 minutes left. And in addition, we advocated, as part of our demand reduction strategies and other interventions, legal trade to be considered, not as a silver bullet, but to be one of a parcel of solutions. So in this period, we have some 3,000 NGOs who have established themselves to try to get involved in rhino conservation protection, many of them, unfortunately, for their own financial gain. So in other words, we have three categories. We have those who are carrying out acts which are blatantly fraudulent, well-intended and naive, and effective and good, being the three categories. Very few of them actually own rhino and have very little risk and provide very few alternate solutions. So we then have a whole mixture, and I don't have time to go into it, but these are the kinds of arguments that come up as to why legal trade cannot be supported. But to every one of these points, we in fact are able to give a counter-argument. For example, they talk about parallel markets. Well, yes, there's a parallel market in every single commodity, from stolen motor vehicles to blood diamonds, and so it carries on. So, but we believe that we are able to address the issues that have been raised and the concerns that have been raised to neutralize the issues that are being raised by the animal rights communities that are concerned that, in fact, instead of stopping, we will stimulate. We are sensitive to the impact on range states, and we also look at the comparison of other species which are utilized on a sustainable utilization principle. We are very alarmed that, like with the drug trade, the situation simply will not go away with more of the same strategies, despite however many billions you wish to expend. So, unfortunately, this polarization indirectly aids and abets the criminal activities, because whilst we debate, so the rhino are unfortunately being severely impacted on. We are seeing tremendous arguments on economic theories, etc. Sadly, it is we, the private sector, together with state and provincial, who have invested billions, not only in land, but in the species itself and the security and conservation, that are now being dictated to by many of these social media organizations, going up so far as to say we should burn the dividends, in other words, burn the horns. Now, where do you have it where an Anglo-American shareholder is told he may not trade his shares, and furthermore, the dividend that he has in his investment, he is required to sell? So what is the solution? An integrated approach where we looked at demand reduction, end-user education, lifting the moratorium. We believe that through our DNA methods, we are able to determine the difference between bloodhorn as well as the so-called legitimate horn. We're looking at various methods of how these horns could be sold on a international platform, but with the importance of better policing, better political intervention, and most importantly, to bring revenue back to conservation and security. So as has been mentioned, so what's the way forward? We're at risk once again of, if the doomsayers, the worst case scenario, that in the wild, our rhino will be extinct by the year 2026. Hopefully we can push that envelope out further. It's part of a national heritage. It's every South African's responsibility to get involved and assist. So we look again at, as I mentioned, demand reduction, education of end markets, international law enforcement, political will and pressure, and most importantly, can we as conservationists stop polarization? Let us look together. If we are conservationists, let's all stand under the same flag and look for constructive ways. There are enough bad guys for us to tackle without having to what's the right word, attack each other. And there is, so we, as indicated earlier on, our intention to bring conservation revenue back to national, provincial, and private reserves and turn worthless stockpile into conservation revenue. So what will happen first? A change in consumer demand, the problem goes away. The demise of all wild animal per the 20 range states, and ultimately trying to bring value back to rhino conservation. Thank you.